Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, once again, Dr. Djene Bajalan. He is a historian of the Middle East at Missouri State University. Djene, thank you so much for rejoining Left Reckoning.
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be with you, Matt.
It's great talking to you. You can also see Gene on This Is Revolution, and we've had him. We haven't had you on Majority Report in a while, although your name did come up kind of actually for this topic.
I do like to make sure at least I get on Majority Report once a year, just to keep my finger in there. So if you want me on for something, I'm more than happy to.
We'll be doing that. But actually, so Erdogan, president of Turkey, recently, would you characterize it as sort of midterm local elections?
Yeah, it's local elections. I mean, a good equivalency is, the concept of the midterms, in a lot of, systems of government, you have your main general elections. Often you'll have your presidential and parliamentary elections at the same time. America's a little weird, obviously, because of the way that elections are scheduled according to the Constitution, and you have this kind of endless rhythm of elections, but most countries aren't like that. So, when we look at local elections in many of these countries, that whether that's Turkey, whether that's Britain, whether that's France, those local elections often play the role of midterm elections in sort of the political cycles of these countries. They're kind of often where you'll get protest votes, where you'll get get an idea of which way the wind is blowing. But of course, they have their own specific dynamics that don't necessarily translate 100% into what will happen in a general election. And so, we've seen in Turkey, we had a presidential election where Erdogan was successful and won. But in this midterm election, Erdogan's not in the ballot, and his party, basically had a quite unsuccessful, at least comparatively unsuccessful showing in these local elections, which are for the belediyes, which is the local council. You have the metropolitan ones, the provincial councils, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an election for local government.
And for folks who haven't seen maybe our more basic breakdowns of President Erdogan, maybe on TMBS, who is President Erdogan?
Sure. So President Erdogan, he has ruled Turkey since the early 2000s. He was a member of a conservative Islamist political party. He was jailed for giving a speech. He served as the mayor of Istanbul. And in the 1990s, the Turkish Constitutional Court, the secularists, shut down this conservative Islamist party, the Refah Party. It won some elections and, eventually got kind of kicked out of government in a soft coup. And Erdogan and a group of other kind of conservative political figures established a new political party, the AKP, which deviated from the Refah Party, which was this original party. And we'll come back to that because the Refah Party is still around, or at least a new iteration of that party is still around. But basically, you had the old guard of the Refah Party continuing in its direction, whereas Erdogan really started a kind of new trend of combining, conservative political values, talking a lot about democratization, adopting a lot of neoliberal politics. And, his party came into power, and he's ruled Turkey ever since. First as prime minister, and then eventually there was a constitutional change. Turkey was a parliamentary system, and Erdogan became president. And, after he became president, there was this big move in 2017. They had a referendum and transformed Turkey into a presidential system. So, he first ruled as prime minister. Then there was this period where he was president, where officially he didn't have all the power. It was still in the hands of the prime minister, but he was kind of like de facto the ruler of Turkey. And this kind of de facto situation was basically confirmed in this 2017 referendum, which established Turkey with a very strong presidential system. And, the general trajectory of his rule, in very broad strokes, the early phases of the AKP rule were often got praise from Europeans, from people in the West. as being an example of, a conservative Islamist movement that was moving towards democratization, etc., etc. But especially since the 2011, 2012, and more, there's been an intensification of authoritarian rule in Turkey. This really kicked off in 2015 and 2016. 2015, Erdogan suffered a defeat, a semi-defeat in national elections, and that pushed him towards a more authoritarian posture. And then there was this failed coup in 2016, which never let a good opportunity go to waste. After the coup, we see like a real tightening of the grip of the AKP on Turkish politics. That being said, there is still, there's still elections being held. They're often described as being free, if not fair. Turkey does have a vibrant civil society, so there are some counterbalances towards Erdogan's authoritarianism. But definitely we've kind of moved to this very powerful, Erdogan is a kind of very powerful political leader, very much in the mold of, what Donald Trump would perhaps like to be, and he's a very successful political operator. And one of the causes of his success is that he's an opportunist. And I don't mean that in a kind of critical way, but he's been able to kind of shift with the winds of politics over time, rebrand himself, and win a lot of support, not just through ideological suasion, but, for a long time, until recently, at least until the economic crises in Turkey recently, his government was distributing material benefits to its base, which were, often groups that had historically in Turkey been marginalized within the political system. So he was able to kind of build a kind of coalition, which he's reconfigured over the years depending on the changing political winds. So he's a very successful political operator. But he wasn't on the ballot this time, and his party, the AKP, suffered one of its worst showings. It's important to note that even though it did have a bad showing compared to what it did, and that the opposition party, the Republican People's Party, the CHP, did quite well, some people are perhaps going a little bit too far. There's only a couple of percentage points difference between the two parties, but the opposition is so used to losing over the last 20 years, like the fact that they were able to pull ahead of the AKP, even though it was only by a few percentage points, has been a major point of discussion in Turkish politics, and opposition people have been quite elated about that. And perhaps, going a bit too far saying that there's a CHP landslide. I wouldn't call it a landslide, but certainly they have really pulled back, they've really dealt a kind of blow to the AKP.
What are the economics? Because that's what I've seen as the main thing cited for the sort of, I guess, disappointment Erdogan's party faced. Well,
Turkey has faced a number of, economic crises, but obviously one of the things that's hitting Turkey really hard is inflation. Before the presidential elections, the interest rates were kept artificially low. But since the presidential elections last year, after Erdogan won, the interest rates has risen, but we still have this huge inflation. A lot of Turks are feeling the pinch, feeling a real pinch in terms of their finances. Just like bread and butter issues. And of course, there are a whole bunch of issues ranging from corruption to, the perception that, the benefits go to those who are close to the party. There's been criticism of the way that the reconstruction effort in the areas affected by the earthquake that struck Turkey not so long ago, the way that those have been distributed. So we're seeing a lot of, criticism inside Turkey towards the way that the AKP has been managing the economy. It's not that those problems were not there before. The issues of inflation, unemployment, all these things have been facing Turkey for a long time. And, to give Erdogan his due, there isn't much, Turkey's kind of between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, you keep the interest rates low, and then you end up with inflation, huge inflation. You you raise the interest rates. Well, we all know what raising interest rates means: throwing people out of work and creating even more unemployment. So the AKP, although it gets a lot of criticism in terms of its economic policy from the international community, it's really, between a rock and a hard place. And it's not helped by the fact that increasingly over time, the AKP has, basically being taken over by Erdogan's flunkies. When the AKP was established, what made it quite unique in Turkish political history was that, it had quite a few sort of centers of power in that party. There were quite a few big guns in the party. But, over time, they have kind of retired out of politics. And, now you have this kind of like coterie around Erdogan, dominating things, dominating the economy. And so, there's anger about this, and this situation has only gotten worse since the presidential elections, because, once the elections were over, it was like interest rates up time.
Interesting. Let's talk about the opposition a little bit. You mentioned Erdogan was mayor of Istanbul. My understanding is the opposition took both the mayoralties of Istanbul and Ankara. Who is this opposition, and what are they running on?
Yeah, so Turkey's largest opposition party is the Republican People's Party, also known by its Turkish acronym, the CHP. Now, the CHP is, you'll often read, it's the party of Ataturk, the founding party of the Republic, which is sort of true, but the original CHP, which, was a kind of nationalist political party at the beginning, during the 1920s and 30s, was a kind of nationalist political party which contained within it kind of left-wing nationalists, right-wing nationalists. It was kind of an incoherent political party in a certain way. In the 1970s, it, at least in theory, attempted to become more, quote-unquote, social democratic. However, in the 1980 coup, the party was banned. Many of its political leaders were excluded from politics, but eventually it was reestablished. So this is kind of a revival of the party of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Republic of Turkey, and it has throughout the throughout the 1990s there were a series of weak coalition governments in Turkey, but the election that brought the AKP to power, due to the bizarre nature of the Turkish electoral system, they had at the time something known as the 10% threshold, which meant that in order to get into the parliament, you had to get at least 10% of the national vote, or run as an independent, but mainly 10%. But when the AKP was elected, the Turkish political scene was so divided, only two parties got over that threshold, the AKP and the CHP. So they emerged as the main opposition, and they obviously counterposed themselves. A strong part of their political identity has been opposing Islamism, maintaining Turkish secularism, and they had a very antagonistic relationship with the AKP over the years. And they were a kind of undemocratic party. They often sought to work with the judiciary. There have been accusations they worked with the military to try and get the AKP lawfare out of office. And they were dominated for a long time by their leader, Djene Bajalan, who only left the party when he was caught schlopping his secretary on camera. And then the new leader, Kılıçdaroğlu, again, he kind of moved the party he moved it away a little bit from the hardline Turkish nationalism of the CHP, a little bit softened on that. But he again was a kind of authoritarian party leader, and basically, lost numerous elections, didn't fall on his sword. And it was only after that last presidential election that he was ousted from the CHP, which was actually quite a surprise because he tried to hang on despite losing the presidential election. So, you now have a new leader of the party. But what's more important, perhaps from the perspective of these leaders, is that the CHP also had several strong mayoral candidates. And mayors in Turkey are really important. Like, they are political leaders who are elected with some of the biggest democratic mandates in Turkey. Like Mayor of Istanbul is a big position, and you have this guy Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is a very kind of charismatic political leader who came to power in the late 2010s in Istanbul, overturning a long tradition of AKP control over municipal government in Istanbul. Again, this is a kind of big blow to Erdogan, because this is where Erdogan was mayor. I saw one of the Turkish newspapers was making the joke now that Erdogan was now a constituent of the CHP, of the CHP now. So you have these very powerful local government figures. Also, there's there's another important figure in Ankara. But when these powerful mayors, the AKP was hoping to oust them in these elections. Not only did they fail to oust them, but their showing was quite weak. In the previous local government election, for example, in Istanbul in 2019, the AKP basically tried to, the election was close, and the AKP basically forced Istanbul to rerun the election in the hope that, in a second go round, their guy would get in. Now, this failed, but, it was still a close election. This time, wasn't even that close. CHP not only maintained control of those major municipal councils, but extended its control over a lot of municipal councils. And if you look at a electoral map of Turkey at the moment compared to before and after elections, you'll see there's usually the AKP is like yellow and the CHP is red. You'll see like the red is like all over Western Turkey. They have a lot of control over big municipal areas. I mean, one joke on Turkish Twitter was like, "What's happened here? There's so much red on here. It looks like the Bolsheviks took over." So so you have this big. This is like a big shift in control of local government, and it's not just the CHP who have gained at the expense of the AKP. There are other political parties that have gained. For example, Yeniden Refah, I don't know how you would translate it, but like the new Refah Party, the Refah Party once again, the kind of new iteration of this original Islamist party that Erdogan had been a part of. They had in the presidential and parliamentary elections allied themselves with the AKP as part of a kind of electoral alliance, but this time they ran independently and they took a couple of councils, local government belediyes off the AKP as well. The AKP lost in Eastern Anatolia to a Kurdish political party, Dem Party, which is the kind of new iteration of Kurdish political party in Turkey. So it was a kind of bad showing because they lost from a number of different directions. They lost from the right and from the secularists.
It might be too early, but is there anything before we move on to maybe the international policy? Is it too early to say what this means domestically for the AKP or for Turkey generally?
Well, that's a really good question. There have been kind of moments over the last decade or so in which people have kind of predicted this is the beginning of the end of the AKP. So I'd be very careful about thinking that this is the beginning of the end of the AKP. For example, in 2015, when the AKP lost its parliamentary majority, people were like, "Oh, this is the beginning of the end." But that only facilitated further consolidation. Again, in 2019, when the AKP lost control of local governments in Istanbul and Ankara, people like this is the beginning of the end. But then, of course, Erdogan won re-election in the presidential election. The AKP remained a major political party. So this again certainly is a blow. But sometimes I think that the AKP, and maybe I'm being a bit conspiratorial here, I think they do allow a little bit of they do allow this democracy in local government as a way for people to let off steam. I think that's part of of this, because what I suspect we'll see, and we've seen this before, is that the Erdogan has this strong presidential system, so the AKP can always kind of shift political powers away from local governments towards the central government as well, because why local government is important is because it's often a mechanism through which patronage is distributed. You have this kind of Tammany Hall politics in Turkey, which, to be honest, I wish we had a bit of Tammany Hall politics here in the U.S., because they ain't giving me nothing here. But, there was a really good thing, for example, like the AKP-controlled Belediye, after they lost the election, they have this kind of municipal tent where they do iftar dinners for Ramadan. And they were obviously pretty upset because they closed they were like, no more free dinners for everybody. Sorry, guys. They closed it down. So, I think we may see, for example, shifts in power away from the Belediyes, or, Erdogan trying to use this as an opportunity to let these municipal governments fail as well. So this could be the beginning of the end. This could be like Erdogan's getting on a bit. And because Erdogan has kind of gutted the party of cadre and turned it into a party of yes men, there isn't a great cadre to take over after him as well. So who even knows what will happen when he bows out of politics or passes away. But, I wouldn't count him out completely.
And finally, I can't get over, and you mentioned like the crosswinds, and Turkey's not, sort of unfamiliar with that internationally. And, right now you have not only the Israel stuff going on, but Russia as well. I'm curious, like, I can't get over on October 8th, I think it was, Anthony Blinken tweeting out, I met with Turkish diplomats and we agreed on the need for a ceasefire to secure the release of hostages. What is Turkey's sort of role internationally, just broadly speaking? Because, I think a lot of people sometimes invoke them as maybe they can help facilitate some solution here. I also think probably kind of needing to look out for their own necks. Well, inflation is driving up stuff and threatening their government. So, what is Turkey's role in the world right now?
Well, Turkey has has always, pursued its own national interests, whether that was aligning with the West at certain moments in its history, trying to balance out, during the Cold War, Soviet interests with, those of the West. I mean, in the, 1920s when Turkey was founded, it was founded with the support of the Soviet Union. And then, later on, it moved towards the West. After 1945, it became part of the Western political camp, et cetera, and it remains in the Western camp today. But, it's never been like, let's just say, like, although, you'll hear American foreign policy wonks often talking about, is Turkey moving away from the West? There's there have been historically moments of tension between the West and Turkey, like the invasion of Cyprus was in the 70s was probably was a bit of caused a bit of a ruckus within the Western Bloc, as of course Greece was also in NATO. But yeah, Erdogan has rhetorically definitely adopted much more of the kind of, I would call it, cultural anti-imperialism, the discourse of cultural anti-imperialism. On one hand, Turkey very famously did not sign on to the Iraq War. I would note this was not because of the leadership of the AKP, which was willing to sign on for the war, but there was a parliamentary revolt, and they weren't able to get the support they needed to intervene. But Turkey has a kind of on the surface often has a harsh rhetoric towards the West, but in reality it often plays off tries to extract concessions and benefits from whoever they can in the world. But there is a limit to it because Turkey is structurally integrated into the Western Bloc, although, both economically, although Erdogan has tried to diversify Turkey's economic portfolio. It's still very much economically tied to the West, and of course, politically, militarily, it's it's part of the Western bloc. So there's always kind of been a tension between Erdogan's sort of anti-imperialist rhetoric and the realities of Turkey in the international system, and this is really evident in Turkey's relationship with Israel. Like historically, the secularists in Turkey, had, especially during the 1990s, had a pretty positive, functional relationship with Israel. And despite the deterioration in those relations, especially during the AKP years, the economic and political connections between Turkey and Israel have continued. So there's a kind of tension and contradiction in that. So, for example, I'm sure you'll remember this, Matt. Do you remember the Mavi Marmara, where you had the Turkish ship going to Gaza about I think it must have been like 15 years ago, and then obviously people were killed on that ship. Erdogan did this big like hostility to Israel. There's a famous. Was very critical towards Israel. But what was often missed, and I was in Turkey at the time, was that the very next day, the Turkish government clarified its position, saying that it was still going to take a shipment of Israeli Heron drones to Turkey. And Turkey's, drone industry has historically built off, its familiarity with the Israeli technology. So this has continued, and this had an effect on these local elections because you had Erdogan adopting an extremely pro-Palestinian position, like you said, the day after calling for a ceasefire, etc., etc. But what journalists have managed to show is that not only has Turkey not cut off diplomatic relations or anything. There's a journalist who's now in exile from Turkey called Metin Cihan, who has documented how trade has continued with Israel during this period. And not only trade with Israel, but AKP members of Musiad, which is a kind of conservative business association close with the AKP, they're making money. So, for example, the AKP deputy for Hatay in southern Turkey, turns out that he has connections to a ship that was shipping things to Israel. I've read, again, I can't confirm this 100%, but I've read, for example, claims that the Turkish steel industry has been, replacing, Israel has found it difficult to find some steel suppliers due to attacks in the Red Sea, etc. Turkey has managed to replace that. You have accusations that Erdogan's son is profiting off trade with Israel while his daughter is leading a kind of solidarity campaign. And so, these contradictions, in the face of what's going on in Gaza and also how long and sustained it is, seem to have had some effect on the AKP vote. I think some people may have switched to Yeniden Refah, this kind of more conservative Islamist political party, as a response to that. So, I wouldn't say that it was like perhaps the primary issue, but certainly this hypocrisy, I think for many Turks, was illustrative of kind of the broader issues facing the Turkish political establishment. You're being told one thing, you have all these government officials crying for Palestine, crying for Gaza, while at the same time, they're getting their, pockets filled either directly or indirectly through trade with Israel. And for people, this is just seen as a kind of one of many blatant hypocrisies of the AKP leadership.
You gotta love democracy. Djene Bajalan, I'll have a link to Djene's Twitter so you can follow him if you're not already. Thanks so much, Djene, for joining us once again.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. You take care of yourself.
You too.